Sex is the life force energy that runs through us all. Can you use sexual energy for your spiritual evolution? Or perhaps for emotional healing? Is it even possible? Clinical sexologist Dr. Martha Tara Lee will explore all these and more on Eros Evolution on OMTimes Radio.
Welcome to Eros Evolution, where sexuality and spirituality meets. My name is Dr. Martha Tara Lee, or Martha, and I am a clinical sexologist. I operate from Singapore, and my company is called Eros Coaching. You can find me on eroscoaching.com. So today, the title of our show is Exploring God as Eros. Christianity has emphasized the shame and guilt of our sexual needs and desires so much that even those who are religious or Christian still wonder if a person of faith can legitimately celebrate sexual pleasure and sexual freedom. But the Beverly Dale challenges all sex negativity with a different view of the Christian message. She says it is time to celebrate the sexual body. So let me introduce my guest today. Her name is, we address her as Rev Bev, and she is an ordained Christian clergy in the Christian Church, Disciples of the Christ, and a graduate of the Chicago Theological Seminary. She has spent most of her 30 years of ministry helping people reconnect their spirits and their bodies and confronting sex negativity in the Christian church and wider culture. Rev Bev was an ecumenical campus minister at the University of Pennsylvania for over 2 decades, where she became aware of the issues and struggles for young adults, both in the hookup culture and in the sexual minority communities. An artist and writer, she has wrote, produced, and performed in a one-woman show and is currently completing her sexual and spiritual memoir, Sex Without Apology, Becoming a Sex-Positive Person of Faith in a Sex-Negative Culture. Her activism as a public theologian continues as the founder of the Incarnation Institute for Sex and Faith, a non-profit that teaches an inclusive, science-friendly, sex-positive Christianity. And her website is www.revbev.org. That's REVBEV.org. And you can check out her website as we continue with this show. So welcome, Rev Bev.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, Martha.
Thank you for coming on. You have a lot of experience in the work that you do. Could you tell us more? How is it that you begin to do this work of reconnecting the body and the spirit?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was, first of all, a personal issue for me. It comes out of my own spiritual story of having a very negative sexual beginning in my life with inappropriate actions of an uncle who was learning his sex education on my body. And that set me up to have very bad sexual boundaries and ended up with a marriage that was ill-advised. You know, it was a pretty messy sexual story. And I did not hear any positive messages about girls or about sexuality from my church. There was a lot of silence at that time. Things have changed in Christianity because now there's a lot of negativity that's quite out there and making headlines, in fact. So for me to be spiritually whole, I had to address the sexual repression and the bad sexual messages I got, both in the culture and in the church, and to be so the intersection between the spirituality and sexuality is my story. So I to be sexually whole and psychologically whole, spiritually whole, they all worked together. So as I'm learning academically how to approach these issues and theologically, I also realize that there are other people in the same boat as I am who have not heard any positive words about their gender or their body, either from the church or the culture. So my story has turned into how can I share it with other people to liberate them as well. And then I went into the ministry with the idea that this needs to come from the church. We need to be having some words of hope and words of grace from the Christian church. And unfortunately, we haven't heard that a lot. So that's what I'm doing now.
Thank you for sharing this. So I'm curious to know, did you grow up in a religious family?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. They were very religious. Every time the church doors were open, we were there on the second row from the front, as a matter of fact. So, yes, and the Bible was very important to my family. So we read the Bible, we had family devotions, we prayed before every meal. We were very religiously observant. And my family was considered to be a strong Christian family. My father was very active in the church as a leader. But I grew up in a Christian church that did not empower girls. They, even today, still do not allow women to be ministers. So though I thought God was calling me into the ministry when I was 11 years old, my church said that wasn't possible. So I thought God made a mistake, and I didn't pursue that until I was in my early 30s. And by that time, the women's movement told me that, yes, it's okay to be a woman, and it's okay to follow your heart and do what you feel called to do. So I had to go back to my church and say, well, I heard these wonderfully affirming things from the women's movement. Why didn't I hear it from the church? And so that began my struggle to try to figure out what was culture or Western culture in the interpretations of the Bible and in church teachings, and what is truth and what is helpful to our spiritual journey. So, and I went to seminary in Chicago and discovered some wonderful writings of theologians, especially women theologians, who were looking at the scripture differently than previous generations of men had looked at it, and discovered that, yes, much of my wounding from the church comes from the culture that has been instilled in Christian teaching. So part of our work is to figure out, how is God speaking to me and my spirit, and how can I determine whether or not this is simply cultural rules that I have to obey that may or may not be what God is calling me to be about. So that's the challenge before us. Every generation of Christians have to decide how to reinterpret scripture that fits the needs of the day. And so that's what I was doing as well. And I think it's time for the Christian church today to begin to look at the anti-sex teaching, the negativity that comes out about the body, and say, no, that's cultural. That's not from Jesus. That's not what we should be teaching and living. In fact, there's a lot of damage that happens to people when we tell them their bodies are ugly, or they are second-class citizens, or some people are more important because of the color of their skin or how much money they have. You know, that's not good Christianity, and yet it's related to our bodies. And so we need to look at bodies differently.
Thank you so much for sharing. It seems like you really been through quite a journey, you know, in your personal life with regards to your sexuality, and also with your spirituality, finding that you can actually be a minister. There must have been quite a lot of things that you've gone through in your life, and And now you do such important work with your memoir that's going to come out, and also with the Incarnation Institute for Sex and Faith that you started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm excited about it. I am what you call a senior citizen at this point. So it took me my whole life to kind of figure these things out and get to the point where I can say I need to speak my truth now. And my truth is that the church doesn't understand the body. And so we, particularly women, need to claim our truths and say, some of this stuff has to change. So my spiritual journey included looking at God all over again. I had to, at first, all children understand God to be very much like their parents, because their parents have life and death control over them. And so that's what it seems like God is. But as we get older, we tend to lose that understanding. And sometimes people don't replace it with a positive image that really works for them. So I had to shift my God from a judgmental, punishment-oriented figure that favored males and did not care too much about women, and ask myself, well, if God is a God of love, as the scriptures indicate, then what kind of love would that be? And how is God a lover God? And that's when I began thinking about God as Eros, or passionate love. And that totally shifted my understanding of how to approach God.
So we have a slight break, and after that we will explore more about God as Eros.
Okay.
The future of internet radio is here. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
Have you bought into the idea that you have to work hard for your money, that business is hard? I will share some dynamic access consciousness tools to get you out of your own way so you can create a business that actually succeeds. Join me, Simone Millisers, on The Joy of Business at 4 p.m. Mondays Eastern.
What if living didn't have to be so serious?
What if you could move beyond your problems with greater confidence and ease than you've ever imagined?
Throw your labels out the window and join the Irreverent Therapist for practical tips and a very different way of approaching the changes you would like to create.
Marilyn Bradford
and Pam Hodling
have empowered hundreds of people to come out of self-judgment, quit looking to experts, and begin to create the lives they desire.
Join us Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on the Irreverent Therapist Show.
Host your show on IOM FM, the radio network of OMTimes Media, one of the more recognized brand names in the conscious community, and is backed by the extensive marketing reach of OMTimes. Hosting a show on IOM FM immediately connects you with our extensive dedicated community. The number one reason girls drop out of school in sub-Saharan Africa is lack of access to feminine hygiene products. The Pads for Schoolgirls Project, an outreach of Humanity Healing International, is changing this paradigm by setting up sewing programs at schools, teaching girls a vocational skill, while producing the reusable pads that help keep them attending classes. The girls pay it forward by making and giving pad kits to other girls in need. To learn more, visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is. Your conscious connection to a more mindful world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
Welcome back to Eros Evolution, where sexuality and spirituality meets. My name is Martha. I'm the host of today's show. And I have with me the Reverend Dr. Beverly Dale, who is an ordained Christian clergy, who is with us today. So you can check out her website at www.beverlydale.org. So you can also look her up by Googling Rev Bev, and that's how you'll be able to find her website. So just before the break, we were talking about how God as Eros is something that can be explored. So Rev Bev, could you tell us more about this concept of God as Eros?
I love to talk about God as Eros. It means passion. Okay, and so I think if we look at the scriptures, let's start with the Hebrew scriptures. God is very passionate about the Israelites. Very passionate, always saying, "Come to me, let me be your God, and you will be my people. I won't abandon you or forsake you." You know, always going after them, and they would do stupid things and abandon God and forsake God and start doing things they shouldn't be doing, and God would be upset and angry, but God would always forgive them. This is a picture of God, of a God who never gives up on the beloved, I should say. But always keeps reaching out and pulling them in, pulling them back, saying, "I love you, I care for you, I belong to you, you belong to me." Passion longs to connect. And that's the story that we get in the Bible, of a God who longs to connect with the creation, longs to be loved. And so that's part of the reason that I understand that. Another reason would be the person of Jesus, who said, "I come to give you life in all of its abundance," in John 10:10. Now, if Jesus was God in the flesh, then we have to say that the way Jesus lived and what he taught was much of what it is to be a divine or a spiritual person in a human body. And the promise was abundant life. And then he proceeded to have a life filled with banquets and feasts, and he was having a good time. He was a party goer, and that's one of the criticisms, according to the writer of Matthew, that he was a party goer and a wine bibber. That's the King James English language, meaning he was having too much fun and he wasn't being a serious religious professional. Well, that tells me that there is a vivacious abundance in spirituality or in the Jesus character, but also in God. That's what it is to love life to the depths. Another aspect of Eros is creativity. When we first get into a relationship, and particularly if it's a sexual relationship, there's a lot of energy that comes with that, a lot of vivacious vitality. And so we have remember that in the beginning, God created the earth out of nothing. Suddenly there was the universe in all of its wonderful creativity. So that's a characteristic of Eros. So the longing to connect, the creativity, and then the story of Jesus and the way in which he embraced life and embraced people around him that certain people thought he shouldn't be talking to or befriending. That tells me that God is a lover God. And we have made God into a patriarchal, stern, judgmental judge that sits on some throne far away and is ready to zap us with lightning or whatever, rather than a lover God who longs to come after us and make love to us, you know? I mean, I love that image. It works for me. Maybe not for other people, but it works for me because it legitimizes my feelings of passion as well as a human being. It's good to be passionate about life and passionate about our bodies because God is passionate about life. Remember when Joshua went into the land of Canaan, and God says to them when they return, "I set before you life and death. Choose life." And I think those are wonderful words to remember, that's the call that we have. And that comes from our erotic, juicy centers that says, yes, little children understand that. And then we spend a lot of time trying to control all of that vitality and energy to make them more like adults. But I think there's something to be said for being passionate and having that energy flow through our bodies in whatever form. It can be through the art that we create. It can be in our bedrooms with our intimate others.
That's right. The passion that we have for life can manifest in the form of creativity, and that shows in everything that we have, in nature, in artworks, in beautiful architecture. That's all part of being alive. And this vitality, this life force energy that runs through us is natural and beautiful.
I'm reminded of a quote by Salvador Dali, the famous painter, who said, he gets up in the morning, he says, when I awake in the morning, I ask myself, I wonder what Salvador Dali will create today. Mm-hmm. And that was such a wonderful curiosity about what will come and what will he make happen, that I think people of faith should be really living like that as well. I wonder what our lover God can make happen in the world today that will bring peace and justice and lots of joy. And then if we can envision God doing that, then we become lovers as well, because we begin to send out those ripples into the wider universe. I think it doesn't take a lot of imagination to understand that there is the opposite force at work in our world today. We can see it in the headlines of hatred and negativity and criticism and dividing the world into us versus them, that leads us to contract and leads us to fear. That's not the path to life. When God says choose life, it's not the path that we're taking now as a global community. And that we need to take very seriously, because we are the only species that sullies its own nest, and that's what we're doing with our planet. Heading towards genocide. Well, that's not towards Eros, so we've got to turn around, and the path is spirit, and the path is to reconnect our bodies to the body that is nature and to the bodies of one another.
That's beautiful what you just shared. I also believe that there are two ways of looking at life. One is with positivity, and one is going down the rabbit hole with getting overwhelmed with all the negativity out there. So choosing to look at life where there is going to be more peace and more justice and more joy on a daily basis will help us to just feel more positive, help us to be more empowered and be able to impact the world in a much better way. And I this doesn't just apply to Christians, I think all of us want to be better people, and we are seeking God in our own ways. And Christianity is definitely one of the ways that has really been misinterpreted and misconstrued in so many cultures. So I'm just curious, what do you think about this whole concept by, I guess, feminists who ask, who challenge and say, well, why can't God be a woman? Do you believe there's any merit in this belief that God could be a woman?
Let me answer that by saying I believe it's a good question. I've been asked that before. I believe whoever our God is will shape our understanding of how to be in the world. So if we believe that God is a masculine God who judges and has a lot of rules, then we will become very judgmental ourselves. But if we believe in, for example, for women particularly, if we believe that God is a nurturer and a feminine, then that will allow us to feel positive about our own bodies and about being a woman, but also that God cares for the universe and cares for us, maybe holding us and rocking us when we cry. So there are lots of metaphors and images of God in the Bible that we could use. A midwife is another one. But just keep in mind that all metaphors are partial and don't completely work, because they're just metaphors, but they point to something else. And the important thing is, what does it lead us toward? If it leads us towards love and grace and acts of mercy, then we've got the right image for us. The female image works for me because I'm a woman and because I need to have a positive, feminine voice in my head and in my spirit, moving me towards caring for the earth and caring for others. So if you need God to be a woman, go for it.
Yeah. Perhaps God is genderless.
I think so. I've begun to think of God in terms of a verb, not as a noun, but as a verb. And that verb, love is a verb. Passion is a verb. Mystery, I think, can be a verb. It's always moving, surprising us with wonderful things. The idea of in the beginning God created, God was in the universe. There's a movement in that word, the Hebrew words that are used there, that God is hovering over the deep. So that's a verb, and that works for me. Maybe it doesn't work for other people, but I like that idea of the force of love pushing through our barriers and our prejudices and our rules, and love moving us towards life at all times. That works for me. It's kind of like the big winds that blow through.
Thank you so much. And on that note of love pushing through the winds, let's have a break. And after we come back, we will talk more about Christianity and our sexuality.
Bringing a more conscious lifestyle to your world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
Circle of Hearts Radio is a sanctuary on the airwaves. Join me, Grandmother Elia, in the circle on Sunday 2 p.m. Eastern as I share information to both enlighten and nourish your soul.
Radio Namaste leads you down the yellow brick road into portals of consciousness with the blue collar goddess as your host. Interviews with humans who could be famous or just popular, and answers to everything are on the agenda. Tune into OMTimes Radio and drop in on Thursdays at 3 Eastern. It's a different brand of enlightenment.
Being a radio host on IOM FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network. As difficult as it is to believe, there are places in Africa where human traffickers sell albino children and their body parts for use in magic rituals. Humanity Healing International is actively working in Uganda to change this paradigm. The Albino Rescue Project finds albino children who are at risk and places them in safe schools and environments where they can learn and grow free from fear. To learn more or to sponsor a child, visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is. Bringing you the best of the conscious minds in the world. OMTimes Radio, your conscious lifestyle on steroids.
Welcome back to Eros Evolution, where sexuality and spirituality meets. And this is Martha. I am a sexologist, and my website is eroscoaching.com. And our guest today is the Bev Doctor, the Reverend Dr. Beverly Dale, and her website is beverlydale.org. And we have been talking about how God is Eros, where God is passionate And this passion shows in different ways in our lives. It helps us with a connection with creation, in terms of the life of Jesus, where he was a passionate person, and how our connection with passion also is very much linked with our sense of vitality, creativity, and that comes forth when we are actually sexual as well. If we begin to see God as a lover or God as a woman, whatever your idea of God is, it should be something that's positive, that will actually help you to feel good about yourself, so that you can actually be the best form of who you are. At least that's what I've been getting from what we've been talking about so far. So,
I think that sums it well.
well, I try to summarize in my own way, and I love how you have so much love in your voice, Rev Bev.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, and I guess I appreciate any younger people than myself who are really asking the right questions. You are asking the right questions.
Thank you so much. There is so much. Because I'm a sexologist myself, so I have clients who come in who are Christians, and it seems that the church is focused on controlling our sexuality and sending out messages of, we should get married, and sex is something that is only meant for marriage. Anything else is where sex is a sin. What do you think of that?
I think that is culture. That is not scripture. It violates what we know about the biology, the evolutionary biology of the Homo sapiens species. So I think one of the writers that I have read talked about the unholy trinity that the church uses. The unholy trinity is guilt, shame, and fear. And anytime we hear guilt, shame, and fear being laid on us, we need to reject it. Even if it's coming from a priest or a pastor, that has no place in an abundant life that Jesus promised. Guilt is not a productive psychological state. Now, regret is okay. Regret will allow us to say, you know what, I really shouldn't have done that. I'm going to move a different direction. But guilt allows us to wallow in it and feel badly about ourselves till we die. So it's not good. Shame is a social control mechanism. So if you are stepping out of the bounds, coloring outside the lines, as children do, then shame is often instilled to say, you're a bad person because you colored outside the lines. That, too, is not a psychologically healthy way of controlling children. And then, of course, fear is the opposite of love. Love casts out fear. So I would reject any kinds of teaching that instills guilt or shame or is grounded in fear. So back to culture. So I think the church initially was, of course, this is mostly the Roman church. I want to be clear that Judaism, which Christianity came from, was and is not a sex negative, as Christians made it. And the Eastern Christian churches, Greek Orthodox and the other Orthodox churches in the Eastern world, are not as sex negative as the Roman branch that infiltrated the United States and so much a part of the world. But anyway, so the Roman Empire, if you will, flooded the world, and some of the earlier writings was based on the fact that they were afraid that if people got into pleasure too much, it would turn into hedonism. And if it turned into hedonism, they would not be living righteous lives. And they would not be concerned about Jesus coming back any time. And they would not be supporting the church. Okay, so there was a little bit of legitimacy in that concern about what hedonism will do for us. When we are fully absorbed in pleasure, I don't want to work 70 hours a week. I would rather just enjoy pleasure. What the church did not make a distinction with is irresponsible hedonism, which is when I want to use other people's bodies for my own self-interest, self-centeredness, and pleasure, which is enjoying the sensuality of life. And so what happened is everything got condemned, all pleasure. And so that we begin in the church history to elevate people who would beat themselves or deprive themselves of all kinds of physical deprivation. So that's one of the first problems in the history of the church that elevated separated the spirit from the body. So suddenly the spirit became asexual, and celibacy was a big deal, and virginity was a big deal, and then beating yourself up was also a big deal with physical deprivation, and the body was negative, negative, negative. So that came out of the Greco-Roman world, where actually preceded the Christian church. Socrates and Aristotle and Plato were very negative about the body and about women particularly, and about desire. So that, and they had an either or, a dichotomy, a way of looking at the world. So it was either flesh or spirit. That was before the Christianity, but that was the world in which Paul was writing, and the world in which the early Christians found themselves. So I think I answered more questions than what you asked there. Did I answer the question here, or shall I keep going?
Yes. It makes a lot of sense what you mentioned, how historically, because of, Roman Church going into all this hedonism, which is, and then how that became twisted into physical deprivation, the need to separate sex and spirit and body, and how the body then became the need to control it, where asexuality and then the importance of virginity came in. And that's quite different from what the Christian church is saying about how pleasure and the sensuality of life is positive.
Right. And so much of the church then, because the early leaders in the Roman world knew of the power of pleasure, they wanted to control it and repress it. And so the only way they could see that would adequately control it was to put it under the umbrella of monogamous marriage. And so then in marriage, it's supposed to be bliss and wonderful, and you're supposed to forget all of those years of repression and negativity that you heard. So it's not a very helpful way of presenting it at all.
After years of repressing one's sexuality and connection with their bodies, lots of people will have problems with being able to express themselves openly and freely, even in the context of a committed relationship. Yes,
I have found that to be true, and it's a shame. It's really, because it doesn't have to be that way. That's it. It does not have to be that way. That we are to be personally discerning what is right for us in our intimate lives. This is something that should be decided by ourselves and not by a priest or a legislator or anybody else, a neighbor or a mother. It's our lives and it's our bodies. Now, we need people to help us decide whether or not we are being clear in our vision about whether or not a relationship is ready to move into the physical, for example. So it's good to have friends that we can talk to about whether or not we're seeing clearly or discerning the spirit clearly. But actually, it really should be a matter of conscience and a matter of being able to determine where's the relationship? Does it work? Is it have we considered the consequences? Are we being clear? Are we talking honestly with one another? Because that's another thing. When we repress sex, we don't talk about it. And when we don't talk about it, we make a lot of mistakes in terms of making assumptions we should not be making.
Yeah, I really agree with you on all these points that you're saying, because people who are, I found they don't have, especially in Asia, where kids are supposed to keep quiet and not say anything and then just study hard so that they can have a good job and career down the road when they grow up. They actually grow up not having what you call personal discernment, and they don't know how to exercise it, just like how we exercise a muscle. And it becomes quite challenging when we grow up, because we don't really know how to make decisions for ourselves. So I do get asked a lot of questions along what's normal, what's right, as if I'm the thermometer of that for them. And that really stems from lack of confidence in making their own decisions. And it's very much linked back with what you're saying, how sexuality is suppressed and not talked about. So am I right to say that you're probably one of the few people who actually talks about sexuality in the religious context of Christianity?
Well, in a positive way. There are many who talk about it in a negative way and a restrictive way. There are writers that I read and who say wonderful things. I do have a bibliography on my website, so that might be helpful to people if they would like to check that out, of theologians who write very positively about the body. But I guess my interest are those people who, like yourself, may be sitting in a pew and they're not hearing anything positive about God and the body. So that's where I want to be focusing my attention.
That's wonderful. So after this break, we'll explore more about sexuality and the Bible.
Okay.
Free your mind with OMTimes Radio. IOM-FM.
Hi, this is Angela Levesque, host of Entanglement Radio. Join me Wednesdays at 12 p.m. Eastern for inspiring conversations with visionaries in spiritual science and conscious healing. Entanglement Radio, Wednesdays at 12 p.m. Eastern. Transcendent talk for the conscious mind.
Hi, this is Sylvia Henderson, intuitive life coach and energy healer. Are you ready to elevate and rise way above your normal? Be sure to listen to my show, Intuitive Transformations, on OMTimes Radio, Sunday evenings at 9 p.m. Eastern. Get the inspiration you need to transform your life.
Host your show on IOM-FM, the radio network of OMTimes Media, one of the more recognized brand names in the conscious community, and is backed by the extensive marketing reach of OMTimes. Hosting a show on IOM-FM immediately connects you with our extensive dedicated community. What if business could be fun? What if business is the adventure of living? What are you choosing? Where do you do business that makes it easier, more fun, or more joyful for you? We'd love to see where you do business. Connect with us on Instagram at Joy of Business or Twitter at Joy of Business, and share your pictures with hashtags BusinessDoneWhere and Joy of Business. Let's change the world with business. The best of the holistic, spiritual, and conscious world. OMTimes Radio. IOM-FM.
Welcome back to Eros Evolution. You are listening to Eros Evolution on the OMTimes Radio Network. You can share this show with your friends by sharing them this link, omtimes.com/mobile. With this link, your friends will be able to listen to the radio show without needing to download any application. How convenient is that? So let's come back to the show. And I would like to ask the question of sex positivity and the Bible. Is there any mention in the Bible about sex being important and positive, Rev Bev?
we have to read between the lines on that. I've already talked about the life of Jesus and the way Jesus interacted with women, for example, which was countercultural. He violated all kinds of cultural rules by talking to who he did and touching people that he did. And there's certainly a wonderful erotic book called The Song of Songs in there, which is an erotic poem, probably not at all written by King Solomon. That was a rumor. But it was probably read or sung perhaps at feasts, wedding feast. Anyway, that particular book is very erotic. And in English anyway, they have kind of cleaned it up a little bit. So the verse that says, for example, your love is sweeter than wine, which that's talked about quite a bit, quoted quite often. Well, that's not what the Hebrew word means. The word does not mean love. It unequivocally means love-making. Your love-making is sweeter than wine. So if we look carefully and read it in a discerning way, we can find a couple who are very erotically charged, very sexual with one another, and they are not married. We know that because there are a number of verses in there talking about how the brothers, or she calls them her mother's sons, are not happy with her relationship and her running off with this person. So that would be one way. But it's clear that we have to unpack the Bible because they lived in a pre-modern time with a pre-modern worldview. And here we are, not just modern, we're post-modern now. The writers themselves were writing in the Hebrews, or in the Christian scriptures, in the Greco-Roman world that has its own culture. And then the translations that we're reading, those translators also bring their culture to it. And then you and I might very well read the scripture very differently because of your social location and who you are and your age, for example, and who I am and my experiences. So we have a lot of layers to go through to get at what God is calling us to be about. So I've already mentioned the scriptures that I think are helpful. And then we can look in 1 Corinthians, for example. The church in Corinth was giving Paul a lot of questions about sexuality. And that's why in those, like chapters 7 through 11, there's a lot of his answers about sexuality. And some of it he guesses at and says, I'm not really sure, but this is what I think. And some of it he feels more confident that God would answer this way. So we know that the early church grappled with sexuality in ways perhaps not that dissimilar than the way we do today, but they were certainly open to it. But so I guess the big thing here is to remember that the Spirit who resides within each of us can help us find our path and our own way. We have a lot of work to do, and intellectual work, and figuring out, when the books were written and what was the social context then and who was translating nowadays, to understand maybe why they would translate a word one way because that serves a political agenda. So I guess I'm hopeful and I'm not so hopeful. I'm not so hopeful because there's a lot of work. There is no single verse that says it's okay to have a lot of pleasure and a lot of fun. That's just not in there. But I am hopeful because I believe that the Spirit calls us, and in our heart of hearts, we know when we're being loving and we know when we're being mean. We know when a relationship is probably ready for some loving expressions that take a physical form, and we know when we're just trying to fool ourselves and try to get something that maybe we're not ready for, partner's not ready for, so forth. So in that sense, I think if we stay attuned to the God within, or this Holy Spirit is the way the Christian church talks about it, that we can be nudged in the direction toward righteous living. and toward loving ourselves and loving other people.
As you mentioned, we need to have personal discretion and discernment, and this need to unpack the Bible really is also about how the Bible is interpreted through many layers of filters. So, so thank you for sharing that. So, I was just wondering, how you feel we can now connect or reconnect with our bodies and our spirit.
It starts with loving ourselves and trusting the inner wisdom that we have inside us. It starts with recognizing that there are many people and many forces in our world that attempts to cripple us and cripple our spirits by controlling, over-controlling, for example, or by using awful means such as guilt, shame, and fear. But if we can begin to love ourselves and listen to that inner wisdom, I believe that we'll be able to, in turn, love one another in ways that are good for us and good for the world. So it begins within us. And I think if we can envision, play around with our image of who God is, if we've got a God who is, as I said before, a judgment-oriented God, then we're going to be judgmental to ourselves, and that's not helpful. So let's think of a God, a creator God who makes body parts and calls them good, very good in Genesis 1. A God who we have a couple of biological parts on our bodies that are there only for pleasure. Only for pleasure. No other reason. That to me says that the mystery that created us, however that was, wants us to have laughter and joy. So looking at our own bodies as a sacred gift, I think is a big step. Most of us don't do that. Most of us will look in the mirror and say, oh, I'm too heavy. I don't like the way I look. No, we're just fine the way we are. God loves us the way we are. Our bodies are sacred gifts from the Creator, and we're all made in God's image. And most of us can't get our head around that either. But we must begin to love ourselves and be kinder and gentler to ourselves, which will then help us be kinder and gentler with other people. And that will make the better world, and that's what I'm going for. I want a better world.
I love what you're sharing about the importance of about trusting and loving ourselves, and this can take the form of self-pleasuring, especially since these are biological parts that we were born with and created for pleasure. Tell us a little bit more about your Incarnation Institute. You've created this nonprofit, and I believe that there's some exciting work that's going to come forth from it. Could you tell us more?
We are very excited. We are creating a curriculum that, first of all, for people who are religious leaders in their congregations, or people who are just asking the same questions you're asking, Martha, to teach them how to read the Bible in sex-positive ways. And so that curriculum is being developed, and we'll be holding classes on that. But what we're really going for is stage 3 is we want to put sex educators and counselors in the same room with Christian seminarians or Christian clergy and teach one another about each discipline, so that the scholars of the Bible will learn about sexuality. And the scholars of the body who already know about sexuality will learn about the Bible, and then send them out 2 by 2 like Jesus did to do the kind of work that I'm doing, to talk about, we don't have to live under the unholy Trinity. There is something better, and we can all be missionaries of pleasure. And I think that's the direction we need to be going, because the planet is crying out for joy and peace and justice. And that's where we'll go when we begin to love our own bodies. And I just want to give Jesus credit here, because when he was asked about the greatest commandment, he said to love God, but love your neighbor as you love yourself. So you cannot love others until you love yourself. So it begins with me, loving myself and thinking I'm beautiful just the way I am, and then moving out to other people.
Beautiful, just the way you are. I love that. So do check out the website, incarnationinstitute.org, and then you can subscribe to Rev Bev's newsletter by actually going to her website. That's beverlydale.org, and you can click on Stay Connected. So you can subscribe through there, and then you will be able to get news about Incarnation Institute as well. So that's incarnationinstitute.org. Next week, I'll be having the guest, Diane Merpal, and she is a professional sex coach and spiritual teacher. She calls herself the Canadian sex goddess, and she'll be talking about how sexuality is our natural birthright, and she will also be talking about the wounds such as guilt, shame, and our limited beliefs that causes trauma that happens to our sexuality. So join us next week on Eros Evolution, where we will be exploring more about tips, tools, and strategies on how you can unleash the sex goddess within you. This has been Dr. Martha Tara Lee, and this is Eros Evolution, where sexuality and spirituality meets. So thank you so much, Rev Bev, for being with us today.
You're welcome, Martha. Thank you.
And please check out my website as well. That's eroscoaching.com. Right now I'm having a campaign called Eco-Sex, where every year I explore the topic of the link between our sexuality